Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. Today I am going to make a presentation on federal government. Now, when we talk about federal government, we need to know that it's extremely modern concept. Its theory and practices in the modern states are not older than the American Federation, which came into existence in 1787. Now, it's a set of principles that determine the organization, functions, and decision-making process of federation. So, a federation or a federal state, whatever term might be used for that, is a set of legal and governmental institutions which enable to distinguish a particular state from both unitary and confederations. Now, federalism is, according to Sikorsky, a dynamic concept which develops various forms of federal states. Now, thus, a federalism is both an idea and a process, while a federation is the manifestation of these ideas and is subjected to the process which is mentioned below. Now, it is worth mentioning that federalism as a theory of a phenomena, it relates not only to the federal state but also to other subjects where we have to deal with a specific type of competence sharing between the respective units of a particular community. Now, prior to 1776, in United States of America, at the time not united, it was still fighting a war of independence with the British colonizers. The 13 colonies were severely and separately, they were bound to Britain in one way, were they connected together. So, the Declaration of Independence, it announced the colonial states, end of the colonial state and the colonies which came to liberate themselves. So, each independent of the crown and politically independent of each other. Now, but to declare independence, to fight and win the war against British imperialism and to build a new nation, it required a union, and the result was a confederation. So, a firm league of friendship, that is what confederation came to be identified under the name of United States. So, the declared purpose of the confederation was to provide for the common defense of the states and the security of their liberties and the mutual and general welfare. Now, before we talk about confederation in detail, let's try to understand what is the term federalism or federation stands for. The term federation is derived from Latin word fidus, meaning treaty or agreement. A federal polity comes into existence either as a result of centripetal or centrifugal process. That is centripetal, that is drawing towards the center, and centrifugal, that is moving away from the center. So, when the sovereign and independent states, they either because they are too weak to resist foreign aggression individually or because they remain economically backward by sending or by standing alone, they voluntarily agree to unite. As in union, there lies strength, so they form a federal union. Now, such a union comes into existence as a result of centripetal forces. So, the instrument by which a federation is brought about is of the nature of a treaty or an agreement between independent states and the new unit of government, national or central, which they agree to create comes into existence. So, a new state is thus created to which till then the sovereign states surrender their sovereignty and agree to become its component parts known by different names as states, United States of America, Australia and India, and provinces in Canada and Pakistan, and cantons in Switzerland, union republics in erstwhile Soviet Union, and the lands or Länder in the former German Federal Republic, different federal states. Now, when we look at the origin of the concept, we find the central and the national government which comes into existence because of the treaty as a result of such a union. The resultant new state is entrusted with the power of some general character which concerns the nation as a whole. Now, other subjects which are of local interest in which variety of practices are to be permitted are left within the jurisdiction of regional government, states, provinces or cantons, whatever the name might be. So, the powers to legislate on various issues and various subjects. So, the powers so distributed between the two sets of government, central and regional, are protected by constitution, and neither of two can encroach upon the jurisdiction of the other or destroy its existence by itself, and alterations in those subjects which have been categorized can be made by amending the constitution alone. There is no other provision. So sovereignty lies neither in the central government nor in the regional governments, neither can it be divided between the two. As many writers have held, it resides in the state alone and it is exercised by the authority which has the power to amend the constitution. So in a federation, therefore, separate states disappear, their sovereignty being destroyed, and their citizens have divested themselves of the old allegiance, create on the basis of the national unity a federal polity within a new state that comes into existence. So a federation may also come into existence when a unitary state with a large area which needs unity out of diversity divides its power into two sets of government and grants constitutional autonomy to its unions. Now the new apparatus of government comes to be like this, that the central government retains only those subjects which are of national importance and transfers the rest to the jurisdiction of units. Now each autonomous within the sphere assigned to it. Now in this case, the centrifugal forces operate and bring about a federal form of government. For example, the Government of India Act 1935, it envisaged a federation consisting of all 11 provinces and then comprised the British India and those princely states which were to express their desire to accede to the federation after signing the instrument of accession. Now, when we talk about the characteristics of the federal state which comes into existence either by centripetal or centrifugal forces, whatever be the method, the coming into existence of such a state has certain characteristics which are unique to itself. So whatever be the method of its coming into existence and whatever be the system of division of power, a federal polity is a dual government in which powers are divided and distributed by the constitution between a central government and regional governments. So unlike the unitary government, powers of unions in a federation are original and not derived. So they are not the grant of central government, but the gift of constitution. They are constitutionally protected as well. So both the central and regional governments are coordinates. They are independent authorities within the allotted spheres of jurisdiction, and neither can encroach upon the powers of the other. And if any change is desired to be made in the distribution of power, it cannot be made by any one of the two sets of government alone. It must be made by amending the constitution as prescribed by the law which is given in constitution itself. Now this means equality of status, and this is the essence of federalism. Although equality of status does not necessarily imply absolute equality of powers, this is an impossible task and not within the reach of the practical politics, but still such arrangements are made where the provinces and the center, or the states and the center, they have almost equal status. Now let's try to understand the difference between the confederation and federation. So confederation is one of the forms of government that is based on federal principle. So confederation is, we can say, the elder sister of federation. So the process of turning confederation into federation is an intellectually interesting, as well as identifying when this process might be considered to have completed. It needs to understand with a clear insight. So in order to understand this question, one need to understand the term itself, what it signifies. So according to the definition, the confederation or a union of states consists of sovereign states, and these sovereign states are joined together in order to deal with some general, strictly defined and limited common aim. And then further it is pointed out the difference between the federation and a confederation are both of a quantitative and qualitative character, and they differ in regard to the extent of their application in the particular field. The first difference relates to the origin of both forms. Now it is commonly held that a confederation originates as an international agreement made between sovereign states, while on the other hand, the federation is based on rules of domestic law. The other difference lies in the character of the union, that is, a confederation is not a separate, self-dependent state, while a federation definitely is. So, from this springs another difference. When it comes to the issue of sovereignty, a confederation does not possess sovereignty. It belongs only to the entities which agreed the union. In contrast, in a federation, sovereignty depends on the approach and the theory, and it belongs to the entities that create the union as well as to the federation itself. So, a confederation constitutes a union that has been established in order to attain concrete goals, and after having fulfilled those goals, it in theory is almost liquidated, it finishes. And in contrast to that, federation is a permanent union, and it remains as long as the constitution through which they draw their powers, and on equality basis it remains in force. Now, when we look at the distribution of power, we find the distribution of power between the central government and the regional government, it depends on various factors, and every country has its own peculiar problems. Carl Friedrich observes that it goes without saying that such divisions of the competencies, that is, the sphere within which each may operate, must and will vary according to time and space. So, economic and social life, the military and geographical factors all will play a role in determining the particular arrangement that comes into force. So, from a political standpoint, no distinctive generalization or principle can be derived, yet the balance of power is accordingly differently tilted in different federations. In some, it is in favor of the central government, in other, it is in favor of the regional government. But it does not deprive the government of its federal character as long as one is not rendering helplessly dependent, or one is not rendered helplessly dependent on the others for its existence or proper functioning. So, by the federal principle, observes Weers, that I mean the method of dividing powers so that the journal and the regional governments are each within a sphere, coordinate and independent. So, the existence of a sphere of activities for either the central government or the regional, where they are coordinate and independent, is the essential attribute of federalism. Dicey defines federation as a political contrivance intended to reconcile the national unity with the maintenance of state rights. Now, the desire for national unity and determination of each individual unit to maintain its identity and independence is something which is the hallmark of this federal system. Now, if you look at the method of distribution of subjects or powers between the center and the peripheries or the provinces, we find that two methods have been adopted in the distribution of powers between the central government and the regional governments. The system of the United States, Switzerland and Australia, if we look at their federal structure and see what has been the method of distribution, we find that their central governments have been given enumerated powers, and it has been given to them through the enumeration, the counting, whereas the residual power are left with their state governments. That is, enumeration of list is made between the central and the provinces, the states, and then the residual power, the left powers, are given to the state governments. Now, for the United States, this point is covered by the 10th Amendment, which provides that the power not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The Swiss Constitution expressly declares that the cantons are sovereign and so far as their sovereignty is not limited, by the federal constitution. As such, they exercise all rights which are transferred or which are not transferred to the federal power. So, those powers which are not transferred, it remains with the people itself. So the reason for the adoption of this system are largely historical. Now the federal unions in each of these countries, they formed the union of previously independent sovereign states. So at the time of union, the latter, they desired to retain to themselves all governmental powers except as was primarily necessary to confer upon the central government in order that an effective union might be established. So when that is the way a federation is formed, where states come together and determine to form a federation, in that case the residual power remains with the state themselves, and they only give away those powers which are essential for the maintenance of the unity and maintenance of the security of the federation that they have formed. Now, in Canada, the method adopted was just the reverse of that in the United States and Switzerland and Australia. Now, here too, the historical events, they determine the course. All constitutions, as Jennings remarks, are the heirs of past as the testament of the future. So, the persistent racial conflict between the British and the French and the failure of the unitary government, coupled with the cool relations with the United States, now these conditions enforced the argument for unification and for a national authority. So the federal government seemed to be obvious solution, but the experience of near dissolution of American Union in the Civil War, this led the British and the Canadian statesmen to the conclusion that the central governments must possess more power than those that belong to the counterpart in the United States. So the Canadian Constitution, the British North American Act 1868, that is what it was called, accordingly divided the powers between the provincial and the Dominion governments in such a way that the provinces had exclusive control over the list of enumerated subjects and the Dominion had exclusive control over the rest. Now which for greater clarity were enumerated though not exhaustively given. So the legislature of Dominion and the provinces are distinct from each other. Neither has the power to alter the constitution so far as the distribution of power is concerned. In Canada, therefore, enumerated powers are given to the provinces and the residuary powers are left to the Dominion government, that is the central government. Now, if you contrast the method vis-a-vis India, we find that the Constitution of India contains three lists of subjects: the union list and the state list and the concurrent list. So, the residual power, it rests with the parliament, that is the total number of subjects exclusively given in the central government are 97 as compared to 66 which are given to the actual existing control of the states, and the concurrent list contains 47 subjects upon which both union and state make laws. Now here is an enumeration more than anything attempted in any other federation. So the provinces which deal with the conflict between the union and the state laws are interesting. Now in general, what we find, they require that the state laws on concurrent list must give way to the law of the union government to the extent that their repugnancy to such laws, that is, if those laws are against the laws made by the central government, the state government have to give way to the central law and remove their law if it is in conflict with the law already made by the center in the concurrent list. Now, the union government has also been empowered here to legislate on any matter in the state list if the Council of States, that is the Rajya Sabha, passes a resolution by a 2/3 majority declaring a particular subject a subject of national importance or of national interest. Then there is another occasion, that is when emergency is in operation, Parliament makes laws for the whole or any part of the territory of India with respect to any matter enumerated in the state list. So Article 253 further empowers Parliament to pass legislation implementing any treaty, any agreement or convention with any other country within its own border. So the last phrase especially that I spoke is remarkably vogue, as Jennings maintains that because under this provision the Union Parliament can acquire jurisdiction on any subject. So for example, even over university education by the simple process of decision of the Inter-University Board of India, which is an international body because it contains respectively and representatives of universities in Burma and Ceylon. Now, talking about the residual power, which is one of the very important component which decides or which tells the nature of the federation, we find that there are some students of federalism who hold that the federal principle consists in the division of powers in such a way that the powers to be exercised by the central government are enumerated in the constitution and the residual is left to the regional governments. Now, it's not enough for federalism. They assert that the central and regional governments should each be independent of its own sphere. Now, that sphere must be remarked and clearly earmarked in a particular way. That is, the residual power must lie with the regional governments. Now, applying this particular criterion, government is not federal if the power of the regional governments are specified and the residual is left to the central government. The Constitution of United States, Switzerland, Australia embody the federal principles because they distinctly enumerate subjects over which their central legislatures exercise control, and they further provide that power not so given to the central government remain with the states and cantons. But such a test of federalism, in the opinion of Weers, is it concentrates on respectively some superficial characteristics. Now, he says the essential point is not that the division of power is made in such a way that the regional governments are the residual legatees under the constitution, but that the division is made in such a way that whosoever has the residual, neither journal or regional government is subordinate to the other. So, it is no doubt true that the question of residual power is important as it affects the balance of power in a federation, but this factor does not make a government federal. And I emphasize, this factor does not make a government federal. The federal point in a federal principle is whether the powers of government are divided between the coordinate independent authorities or not. And it is immaterial what the system of distribution of power is and where the residual power rests. The circumstances of each country decide which method it adopts, and Carl Friedrich, he points out, saying that the existence of residual power has ever been held to constitute the decisive test of statehood for the component units, but in final analysis, it needs to be assured that those powers are shared among the equals, not among the unequals. Now, talking about the federal and unitary distinction to further understand what federal stands for. So, what distinguishes a federal from a unitary government is that the regional governments are not subordinate to the central government. Now, the one is not simply the creation of the other. So, both enjoy a judicial and corporate personality, no matter whether the division of power is made by enumerating the powers of the central government and leaving the rest to the regional governments, or the division is made by enumerating the powers of both central and regional governments and leaving the residual to the former or to the latter. Now, what made the Canadian Constitution quasi-federal was the matters in which the provincial governments were subordinate to the central government and not coordinates with it. Now, these matters were the powers of dominion execute to disallow any act passed by a provincial legislature, even if it fell within the sphere of jurisdiction. So, the Dominion Executive appointed the Lieutenant Governor of a province, and it could instruct that Lieutenant Governor appointed in the province to withhold his assent from the provincial bills and to reserve them for consideration by the Dominion Executive, and it might refuse assent to such reserved bills if it deemed fit. So, that was what making it a quasi-federal on lines with the Indian federalism, which is also considered quasi-federal because the governors here are appointed in a similar fashion by the central government, and those governors can withhold the assent to certain bills or withhold it or send it to the president for the consideration of those bills. So, that in England case makes it a quasi-federal, and also in Indian case it makes it a quasi-federal. Now, the concurrent list's jurisdiction is found in all modern federal governments, and with it a provision that when the laws of the central government upon matters in the concurrent list conflict with the laws of the regional governments in that field, then the regional laws must give way to the central law to the extent of their unlikeness. So the extent of the concurrent jurisdiction varies greatly in Canada. It consists only two subjects, where in the United States and Australia the concurrent list is extensive. In Switzerland it is similar than in the United States and Australia, though wider than in Canada. And in India the concurrent list covers 47 subjects. So the concurrent jurisdiction is not incompatible with the federal principle. So there are indeed many good reasons for providing concurrent jurisdiction. So Weers is of the opinion that it is better always, if possible, to admit concurrent jurisdiction, if only perhaps as a transitional measure. In most cases, it is likely to work best in a short exhaustive list rather a long concurrent list. Now here one doctrine needs to be mentioned, and that is doctrine of implied power. Now it has again given great constitutional importance ever since it was propounded by the Supreme Court of the United States. Now the Constitution only enumerates the powers assigned to the central government, leaving the rest to the state. But the concurrent and the concluding part of the Article 7 enumerating these powers, it authorizes Congress to make all the laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out execution of the foregone powers which is given in the Constitution, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States and any department or officers thereof. Now the Chief Justice Marshall came to the conclusion that this provision authorizes the Congress to make laws on subjects, though not specifically assigned, yet implied or latent in some other specified powers. Now this doctrine of implied powers is imperceptibly pervading the decision of Supreme Court in almost all federations, thus filling up a gap between the specification of powers and thereby strengthening the central government where it has been assigned certain specified powers. Now referring to Article 8 of the American Constitution, Charles Beard remarks that it has really proved a paradox box of wonders. Now, talking about finally having discussed so far about the basic features of the federation, we find that the federation is born out of the desire for union rather than unity, because unity is the essence of the unitary system, whereas union is the basis of a federation. Then federation follows the federating units to preserve their identity by retaining their independent jurisdiction, save in matters that are of common national interest. Secondly, the states are willing to federate, they lose their sovereign character as soon as a federation is formed and a new state emerges as a result of this union, and it accordingly becomes sovereign. Third, we find that the mechanism of federal government consists of two parts, national or central government and regional governments, called by various names, states, provinces. Now, the power of governments are divided and distributed into these two parts. The central government is given the jurisdiction over subjects of a general nature, which are common to all and among those promoting the union, whereas the regional governments are given powers over matters of local importance and utility, which do not require uniformity. Further, we find that a federation is made and it does not grow. It is made deliberately with a view to having the benefit of union. And since the union establishes a system of dual government in which powers are divided and distributed, a written constitution is logical necessity of such governance. And it also involves rigidity of the constitution so that neither the central government nor the regional governments may be in a position to deprive the other of its power. So if any change is desirable to be brought about, it must be made by amending the constitution wherein both parts of the federations are participants. So the process of constitutional amendment is prescribed in the constitution itself, and this establishes the supremacy of constitution. The supremacy of constitution is essential if the government is to be federal. And then the federation is a permanent union in contrast to various other kinds of unions and alliances between the state. Now with that, I come to the first part of conclusion in the first part of my presentation on federal government. Thank you.